showing them that we can provision an environment, 0 to everything in 15 minutes.
All right. Okay, so I will try not to do too many bird puns, but that's already busted. So we had a really interesting chat a few months ago about something that had been going on. And this is a story of what was going on in community software development. And the best way to start is to, well, you can talk about me for a second, I guess. So I work in Spring Cloud, and that's an open source group in Pivotal that focuses on Java things and software things. And in fact, I've been working with Spring Cloud folks for years because when I used to work at Netflix, I was already collaborating with them in the open source space. But these days I've been working on distributed tracing, and this is not a technical talk, but Zipkin is a distributed tracing thing. And web developers here, if you've ever used like Chrome DevTools and you see like this breakdown of graph of how long things take, think of that, except for your whole architecture. And so like it would look like this, and your long bar is how much total time passed, and you can drill down into the pieces that were responsible for that. And if this were a technical talk, I would blather on for about an hour about this slide and what's underneath of it. But that's not this talk. This talk is about community focus and what happened and what Zipkin is today. And I'm sure folks have seen this before. And like what I think that if I think back, I wasn't at Twitter when Zipkin happened, but you can kind of tell a tale by looking at things like the Twitter's blog and their engineering work, all of which are publicly available. And the first thing I could find in like digging around about what this latency analysis system came from was all of this work where Twitter were trying to respond and engage with the community, the technical community, the engineering community, by talking about how they're trying to fix this fail whale problem where Twitter itself is overloading quite often. And so one blog I found, which was the first one I could link to this latency project, was this thing which was, okay, well, what is a whale anyway? What's behind this image? What is it trying to tell you? And in some cases, it's telling you like we're not, our latency is too high and we cannot service requests, and we're starting to fail. And this was the first thing that I saw, in digging around, where Twitter had actually open sourced something that they were talking about with relation to latency. So, and it's kind of cute because if you look at this was a screen grab of a few days ago, and there's like 0 contributors. How is that even possible, right? and yet there's a couple commits. So there's some zombie out there that went in and committed some things, and there's no one watching it. There's a few stars, and this is sort of how like a lot of open source work starts, really. Like whether we're a company or whether we're a person, we start with something, and maybe no one pays attention to it. But it's our work, and we start to engage somehow. And in this case, it was a little Ruby app to show what a cloud looks like. And this fail whale, it just kept popping up, and it popped up not just from users, but the reactions in the engineering space. So if you look at like the amount of blogs that were about the fail whale, there were quite a lot actually. And so there was this dialogue where the Twitter engineering were or at least a monologue with Twitter engineering with their users saying that, okay, we are paying attention and here's what we're doing. And by the way, this might be interesting to you, like how we're actually attacking these problems, and many of which are open source, but some of them are not. And so as time went by, years in this case, the attention to focus to things like latency, which are things that people care about, because if you're scrolling through and something takes too long, you're just going to move on to something else and maybe not read that tweet. So along the way, there's some interesting things that happen in what I think are interesting from a community perspective. One is that there's this public side of community where you're literally broadcasting and maybe promoting materials to talk about how engineering is working. And then there's the subtle stuff, like commits going by, people writing pull requests that are talking about things, but maybe no one's actively listening. They may be lurking, but there's actually work going on in public space, doing interesting things, but you have to actually dig into the change to see why it happened. And so in this case, I thought what was neat is that in 2011, here we have Marius, who's one of the lead developers at Twitter. He raises a pull request saying, "I'm thinking about this. It's not final, but here's what I'm doing." And in the works, it actually describes the paper Dapper, which happens to be a pivotal work in, no pun intended, in distributed tracing that many products are based on. So citing references, putting code out there. But actually, there was not much engagement. It was sort of just merged pretty much. But it's another thing that happens when you're doing open source work. Sometimes you don't know who's ever going to contribute, and you might be inclined to just push, force push master or do whatever you need to get your code out there. But there's also, you never know. So raising a pull request, which in GitHub terms basically means publishing, which will fire off people's watches and things, that will tell others that you're at least interested in sharing ideas with them. And so this product, Big Brother Bird, never had a tech blog. It just sort of happened, and yet it graced the code base forever. Because there's some of my colleagues who are like, "What is this B3 thing?" And then I dig in, and it's like, well, that was Big Brother Bird. That never really happened, in a way that anyone knows about. But it happened in the code base, and it actually was a pull request. And so other things, are born with more force. For example, in companies I've worked for, Netflix as well, there's this sort of different experience with something that's formalized as a project, and you do a tech blog about it. People are a little bit more nervous about their code because they're going to go out there and then, okay, there's going to be this blog, I better do it really nicely. And I think Zipkin was one of those systems. And Chris A. wrote this blog. Chris A. was behind quite a lot of the open source work at Twitter, including defining policies by which people could even do open source, which is a gift that not everyone has. And in this, it was really exciting. It was, sometimes people read technical papers and they see good ideas, but they don't have an implementation of those ideas. And so they either going to just try and hack them out themselves or wait for somebody else to make one. And in this case, what was neat was that it was an implementation. So, for example, in a lot of open source work, you're only seeing half of it. Like Big Brother Bird was never open source, but the client for Big Brother Bird was. And so okay, there's something out there, but I can't really touch and play with it. And Zipkin was an interesting evolution of that because it allowed people to really engage because they could actually install and run it. And back in 2012, a lot of these things on the screen were interesting to people. So like Cassandra was very interesting. Zookeeper, Facebook's logging system called Scribe was interesting. Twitter itself was straddling between different programming languages. And the latency problem started to go away at Twitter. And it's for reasons including being able to analyze it. And Zipkin had a lot to do with that. Some of the things were technology choices too. So for example, this is another slide of Chris A's that I lifted from one of his presentations that marks some things of interest. Like from not a lot of traffic to World Cup to off the monorail. Now, monorail is a word for like a single Ruby on Rails application that things route through and becomes a bottleneck. And So it's an interesting worldview to like say, okay, I'm going to put on the same graph World Cup and a technical decision. But that's actually what it's like to work in engineering in a social services company. And when latency, this focus on latency, became more background and became more automatic, engineering focused on different things. And so, for example, like Manhattan, here's a blog about our new storage service, or here's how we're doing container scheduling, and here's our new build system and things like that. And the thing is that engineering outside of Twitter continued in different ways. So for example, Cassandra continued to evolve even though Twitter switched to Manhattan. And Docker started to become a thing even though Twitter never used it. And the logging system that Twitter used became archived by Facebook and became almost a swear word. And meanwhile, people are using things like Amazon, which wasn't used inside of Twitter. And so there's this interesting, like, not a fork in the road, but just people moving in different directions. And that's really important from a community perspective. So when we look at, what a lot of this stuff happened from, if you were looking at the community of the people, like actually scrolling through tweets, and the answer turned into a community of technical, engineers mostly, who are interested in a solution to that problem. But the actual context has shifted. And so at some point, this community says, hey, listen to us. We're actually interested in working on Zipkin, but there's a lot of things that are different about your world than our world. And what happened was that Zipkin at Twitter was sort of a solution to a problem and had focused bursts of energy. So, a lot of focus when it was first being made, and there was all these fail whales, and there's really a lot of rallying around latency. And then there's maybe some focus about Cassandra because they're using Cassandra, but then when they use different services, it's displacing this energy, and maybe it's focusing on things that aren't as relevant to open source anymore. And what was even weirder was that over time, the expertise on Zipkin was actually not in Twitter. And it wasn't because people were quitting and working on Zipkin. It was just no one worked on Zipkin long enough to actually accumulate experience, and because they would be working on different projects. And so I found, I was working at Twitter at the time, and I went through and I looked at every single commit and every single pull request that anybody ever made. And I found that the people with 2 or 3 years experience, they were never employees. And the people in the building, they may not even work there anymore. And if they did stop working, they usually didn't work on Zipkin ever again. And so there's this weird thing where the actual center of this software moved, and nobody really noticed it happening until there was a moment of insight from the crowd where it's like, hey, listen, we actually want to improve this product. The other thing that was interesting I found was that the platform diversity is a reality for a lot of people. So in companies that have a mono view, where we have one source code repo and we have one major technology stack, you can have one answer to that. But in the GitHub world, there's lots of stuff going on. So diversity is one of the things that in microservices, some people, I think Groupon were saying they had 25 different stacks that people are running, and it's becoming even more encouraged. And so just the worlds are different. And when I say it down at the bottom, same goals was opportunity, it's all this is true. But at the end of the day, people still want to get to the bottom of latency problems, and it's still microservices architecture. And so there's some way to solve this problem. And I talked with my manager, who's the manager of the observability team, and Chris A. And I was thinking about it. It's okay, well, we can try and staff out this thing, but that's never worked in the past. There's never been a team of Zipkin people at Twitter. There's clearly a team outside of Twitter. Well, what if we moved the center to where they are? And so with some miraculous combination of buy-in, everybody sort of agreed, and that we could actually move Zipkin to the community as opposed to try to do some unnatural things to move the community to where they're not. And so I sent out this email, which basically says that, you guys can now manage your own change, do your own releases, all this stuff, and we're actually going to help. And so Zipkin left the nest and became, Zipkin left the nest, became Zipkin. And, eventually I did too. So about a month after that email, I joined Pivotal. and it's kind of not that random. I was asked actually to write a blog about that. And I think that this deck is pretty much the blog I would have written if I actually followed through on that premise. But the reality is that open source is different than internal open source. And when you're working on a project inside and it's and you have like specific goals and a specific set of responsibilities, and maybe this is project 26. You can't do the same sort of engagement you can with the community who may have different goals. And inside of Zipkin's community, there are already projects from people who had been working on this stuff for a couple of years, had context in cloud computing and Amazon, and they had a lot to share with each other. And I actually had a lot in common with those folks. One of the things that I wanted to do was I really wanted to dig deep into this, and so I sort of followed the project into open source, and through that, a company, Pivotal, who are pretty good at open source in general. So that doesn't mean that like magically Zipkin had a kumbaya moment and the code's awesome now. It doesn't even mean everybody came back as a result of making this open community. It's funny because a lot of times friction to change from a community is because you're defensive, you're thinking it might break your system, and so you don't allow it in. And the one difference that we have in the community is that we break and then we fix it. The anticipating of a failure, is something that can cause you to not make any progress. And so, for example, in many cases, we've had to even reverse change. So one of the things I did summarily when I created OpenZipkin is I merged every single outstanding pull request to, which caused me a lot of grief. Because all of that code, like some of it, was raised 2 years ago and no one cares anymore. And I took it because I felt like that was a better choice to make. Because, I'm going to have tech debt anyway. So, instead cherry picking things, because that was one of the problems. So sort of send the message that this is for the community now, and we'll take on the joys and the pains of that. And so that meant some change need to be reversed and some contained, and lots of code deleted. I think I deleted 70,000 lines of code. And we have little whales that happen occasionally too. And one of them that's common is that, just like, the world inside of Twitter being, versus the world inside your company, everyone's today versus tomorrow is different too. And a topic like tracing is something where it's hard to jump into like year 5. Like you need to start with year 1 and year 2 sometimes, and so people are moving at different speeds. And so, we did some things to try to help make it more accessible, easier to install, and so people can like ease into the technology. And Spring's one of the things that help with that because there's a lot of ease of use tools there. But there's also like tomorrow is important too. So the folks who, like, for example, Uber are one of the users and they're pretty advanced. You don't want to like pin it to one particular time frame in technical evolution. You want to be able to allow people to ease in but also progress. And that's one place that we're still struggling, but I think we're doing a decent job with. And, this is I think another slide earlier today showed like GitHub graphs. And I wish this were colored because there's a huge amount of activity to the right. Most of that's deletes. So one of the things that I like to do is find all the things you can delete in the code base and do that because it helps you focus on what's important. And the community has become more together because we have a focused code base that people are aware of and they know more than they did before. So I think we're able to do more, and that's happened where more people have become involved than ever before. Like, I think when I first started in Zipkin, there were like 5 people hanging out in IRC or something, and if you sent a message, no one would respond. And now there's, I think, 125 people on our Gitter channel, and a year has passed, not even a year. So it's not like Docker or anything, but I think like what I'm trying to say is that communities will grow if there's a place for people to collaborate. The other thing that's particularly of note about this tracing community, which again is, most of this is non-technical, is that we make an earnest effort to collaborate with different products. And I think this is the strongest thing of Zipkin itself to me, and this is what gets me excited. I like that, Apache HTrace, which is a completely different product, an alternative, in fact, that we communicate and commit code to that code base, that we have distributed tracing workshops where people who are even making commercial products get to collaborate with. In fact, we're doing one in Berlin on Monday, and Google are going to be there, and the person who wrote the Dapper paper is going to be there, and we're able to share ideas even though the code and the manifestation of these ideas will be different. And so we basically take off the pressure of the single implementation and really focus mostly on the community itself without a specific agenda. And the main idea is that we're learning a lot of times by mistake, and that requires us to make choices. Like if you make choices, you're acting and you're giving yourself the ability to progress through them. And so with a field like monitoring observability, something people take seriously, you can get scared of it and try to get perfectionist about it. And I think there's been some slides about this also. But it's very, very important to take the opportunity to make a choice, pitch it out there, let somebody shoot it down perhaps, but don't stay stagnant. And I think that's what makes it worth it to me. And I appreciate that you've brought me up here to talk about this. And I don't know if we do questions, but you can ask if you like.
You all think we're running really late, but actually we're not. As I said, time is elastic.